Welcome to Roots of Fear, where we uncover the darkest tales from history's forgotten corners. Tonight, we delve into the mysterious story of the Thornfield family of Elmwood, Arkansas, and the chilling phenomenon that haunted them for decades. In 1854, Elmwood was a prosperous settlement nestled in the rolling hills of northwestern Arkansas. The town's prominence came from its strategic location along trade routes and the wealth generated by its surrounding plantations. Cotton fields stretched across the landscape, tended by enslaved workers whose labor built the fortunes of families like the Thornfields. The town itself boasted a courthouse of imposing red brick, several churches with gleaming white steeples, and a main street lined with businesses catering to the region's elite. Among the elite families who shaped Elmwood society, none commanded more respect than the Thornfields. Their name was spoken with difference in the parlors and drawing rooms of Arkansas society. Their opinion sought on matters ranging from politics to social propriety. When the Thornfield spoke, Elmwood listened. The Thornfield estate, known as Willow Creek Manor, stood as a testament to their influence. A grand antebellum mansion with towering white columns and sprawling gardens that hosted the region's most prestigious gatherings. The manor house had been built in 1832 by Judge William Thornfield's father, who had claimed the land in the early days of Arkansas settlement. Over the years, subsequent generations had expanded and refined the property, adding wings and outbuildings until it sprawled across the hilltop, overlooking Elmwood like a beacon of wealth and stability. Judge William Thornfield, the family's patriarch, had established himself as not only a legal authority, but also as a pillar of the community whose word carried the weight of law itself. A graduate of Harvard Law School, William had returned to Arkansas to build upon his father's legacy, bringing with him not only Eastern education, but also a refined sensibility that elevated the Thornfields above their neighbors. His courtroom was known for strict adherence to procedure and unswerving application of the law, qualities that earned him both respect and fear throughout the territory. The Thornfields seemed blessed with everything a family could desire in these prosperous times: wealth, influence, respect. Their dining table regularly hosted governors and senators. Their parlor had once entertained the future President James Buchanan during his travels through the territory. Their children were educated by private tutors brought from Europe, and their home was filled with art and literature that reflected their cultured tastes. Yet beneath this veneer of perfection lurked a shadow that would follow them through generations, a shadow that would manifest itself in the most peculiar of ways. The Thornfield story would become intertwined with something beyond the rational world they so confidently inhabited. Something that defied explanation and challenged their understanding of life, death, and what might exist in the spaces between. Our story begins on a crisp autumn morning in September 1854 as preparations were underway for what promised to be the social event of the season, the wedding of Elizabeth Thornfield, the judge's eldest daughter, to Charles Montgomery, son of a prominent family from Little Rock. The union would connect two of Arkansas's most influential families, cementing alliances that would shape the territory's future as it moved toward the tumultuous years ahead. The day before the wedding, carriages began arriving at Willow Creek Manor, bringing guests from across Arkansas and neighboring states. The gravel drive leading to the manor echoed with the sounds of horses and wheels as family members, friends, and social acquaintances made their way to the Thornfield estate. Servants rushed about under the stern direction of Mrs. Thornfield, carrying luggage to guest rooms and preparing for the evening's rehearsal dinner. The Thornfield spared no expense. The finest foods were prepared in the manor's bustling kitchen, where the family's cook, a talented woman named Bethany, who had been with the Thornfields for 20 years, directed a team of assistants in creating elaborate dishes that would impress even the most discerning guests. Venison from the estate's woodlands, vegetables from the kitchen garden, and imported delicacies from New Orleans. formed a menu designed to showcase the family's prosperity. Musicians were brought in from New Orleans, a string quartet whose reputation had earned them invitations to play in the finest homes across the South. The manor was decorated with elaborate floral arrangements that filled the air with their sweet fragrance, roses and lilies, and chrysanthemums arranged in silver vases and crystal bowls. Elizabeth, a vision of beauty at 20 years of age, had spent months preparing for this momentous occasion. Her golden hair, a trait inherited from her mother's side, framed a face of classical proportions, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes of vivid blue that could charm or disarm with equal effectiveness. She possessed not only beauty but intelligence as well, having been educated far beyond what was typically expected of young women in 1854. She spoke French and Italian, played the piano with considerable skill, and had read extensively from her father's library, developing opinions on politics and philosophy that she expressed with confidence in the privacy of family discussions. Her wedding dress, crafted from the finest imported silk and adorned with handmade lace, had been the talk of Elmwood society women for weeks. The seamstress, brought from New Orleans specifically for this commission, had worked for months to create a gown worthy of a Thornfield bride. The bodice was fitted to Elizabeth's slender form, the skirt expanding into a bell shape supported by multiple petticoats that rustled with her every movement. The sleeves were long and fitted, ending in points over her wrists, and the neckline modestly framed her throat while showing just enough décolletage to be fashionable without scandalizing the more conservative guests. Charles Montgomery, her husband-to-be, was considered the most eligible bachelor in the region. Handsome, educated at Harvard, and heir to his family's banking fortune. Tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and thoughtful brown eyes, Charles had a quiet dignity that complemented Elizabeth's more vivacious nature. Their courtship had begun at a Christmas ball in Little Rock the previous year, where Charles had been immediately captivated by Elizabeth's beauty and wit. A series of carefully chaperoned meetings, correspondence approved by Judge Thornfield, and formal visits to both families had culminated in a proposal during a garden party at Willow Creek Manor in the spring of 1854. As the sun set on that September evening, the Thornfields hosted a lavish rehearsal dinner in the manor's grand dining room. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the space, their light reflecting off silver candelabras and fine china. The long mahogany table extended to its full length to accommodate the wedding party, and family members gleamed in the candle light. Linen napkins embroidered with the Thornfield monogram marked each setting, and the family's best silver flat earpieces that had traveled from England with their ancestors completed the elegant tableau. Judge William Thornfield, a man of imposing stature with silver-streaked dark hair and piercing blue eyes, raised his glass to toast the young couple. He stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding immediate attention from the assembled guests. At 55, he retained the physical vigor of a younger man, his back straight, his gaze direct and penetrating. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority honed by years in the courtroom, a deep baritone that required no artificial amplification to reach every corner of the room. 2. Elizabeth and Charles, may your union bring you the happiness and prosperity that has blessed our family for generations. May your children carry on the Thornfield name with honor, and may you never know darkness in your days. Together. The guests applauded, unaware of the irony that would soon unfold, for this wedding would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the Thornfield family for decades to come. Among the guests at the rehearsal dinner was a man few recognized, tall and slender, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at those he conversed with. His attire, while formal and appropriate for the occasion, had a slightly dated quality, as if preserved from an earlier era rather than crafted by a contemporary. Tour. His black tailcoat fit his gaunt frame perfectly. His cravat was tied with meticulous precision, and his manner was that of a gentleman accustomed to moving in refined circles. Yet there was something about him that caused discomfort in those who engaged him in conversation, a chill that seemed to emanate from his very presence. He introduced himself as James Barrett, a distant cousin of the bride's mother, having traveled from Boston specifically for the occasion. His accent confirmed his New England origins, the clipped consonants and broad vowels marking him as distinct from the southern guests who dominated the gathering. Despite his claim of family connection, none of the Thornfields seemed particularly familiar with him. Yet, southern hospitality dictated that he be welcomed regardless. "I don't recall Mother mentioning a cousin Barrett from Boston," Elizabeth whispered to her younger sister, Catherine, as they observed the stranger conversing with Judge Thornfield across the room. Catherine, 18 and possessed of a more practical nature than her romantic elder sister, shrugged in response. "Perhaps he's one of those relations so distant they're barely worth mentioning," she suggested. "You know how these family connections can be. Someone's father's cousin's son becomes cousin for convenience sake." Barrett kept to himself throughout the evening, occasionally engaging in brief conversations, but mostly observing the festivities with an inscrutable expression. When he did speak, his voice was surprisingly melodious, a pleasant tenor that somehow failed to warm the air around him. He appeared particularly interested in the family photographs displayed on the walls of the dining room, studying them with an intensity that bordered on inappropriate. Several guests later remarked that there was something unsettling about the man's demeanor, a coldness that seemed at odds with the warm celebration surrounding him. Mrs. Eleanor Montgomery, Charles's mother, confided to her husband that she felt a distinct chill whenever Barrett passed near her, as if a door had been opened to a winter night. "Such an odd gentleman," she murmured behind her fan. "I wonder that Margaret Thornfield would acknowledge such a peculiar relation, even a distant one." As the rehearsal dinner concluded and guests retired to their rooms in the manor or departed for accommodations in town, James Barrett bid goodnight to Judge Thornfield and disappeared into the darkness beyond the manor's illuminated windows. The judge watched him go with a slight frown, trying to recall if his wife had ever mentioned Barrett in her discussions of her extended family. He made a mental note to inquire about the man's exact relationship to the Thornfields over breakfast. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Willow Creek Manor, illuminating rooms already bustling with activity. Servants moved efficiently through the house, polishing silver, arranging flowers, and preparing the outdoor space where the ceremony would take place. In her bedchamber, Elizabeth sat before her vanity mirror while her mother and sister helped prepare her for the most important day of her young life. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon, allowing ample time for final preparations. Elizabeth's mother, Margaret Thornfield, a woman known for her attention to detail and impeccable taste, oversaw every aspect of the arrangements with precision that bordered on obsession. At 45, Margaret retained much of the beauty that had made her a celebrated belle in her youth. Her blonde hair, now subtly streaked with silver, was arranged in an elegant style that framed her fine-boned face. She moved with the grace of a woman accustomed to being observed, her posture perfect, her gestures refined. "The flowers for the altar arrangement are slightly wilted," she informed a harried servant. "Replace them immediately, and check that all the chairs are perfectly aligned. I'll not have a symmetry on my daughter's wedding day." By noon, guests began to gather in the gardens behind Willow Creek Manor, where rows of white chairs had been arranged, facing an elegant arbor entwined with white roses and ivy. The arbor, constructed specifically for the occasion, stood against a backdrop of ancient oak trees whose spreading branches provided dappled shade for the assembled guests. The ceremony would take place here, with the reception to follow in the grand ballroom inside the manor. The guests who arrived represented the elite of Arkansas society. plantation owners, politicians, judges, and wealthy merchants all dressed in their finest attire. Ladies in silk gowns with wide crenolines moved carefully through the garden paths, their bonnets and parasols providing protection from the September sun. Gentlemen in formal tailcoats and waistcoats engaged in conversation about politics and business. Their discussions occasionally turning to the increasing tensions between North and South that would in less than a decade erupt into civil war. As 2 o'clock approached, there was no sign of James Barrett among the assembled guests. Elizabeth's younger sister, Catherine, overheard her parents discussing his absence as they prepared to take their places for the ceremony. Most peculiar, Judge Thornfield murmured to his wife. Barrett seemed quite intent on attending the ceremony. When we spoke last night, perhaps he took ill, Margaret suggested, though her tone suggested she found his absence a relief rather than a concern. In any case, we cannot delay on account of one guest. And so, with the mysterious Mr. Barrett absent, the ceremony proceeded as planned. The string quartet began playing Mendelssohn's Wedding March, signaling the beginning of the procession. The groomsmen and bridesmaids walked down the aisle in pairs, followed by Catherine as the maid of honor. Finally, Elizabeth appeared on her father's arm, a vision in white that drew audible gasps from the assembled guests. Elizabeth was radiant as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her golden hair adorned with a crown of white flowers, her face partially concealed behind a delicate veil. The sun caught the silk of her gown, making it shimmer with each step. Her hands, encased in white kid gloves, trembled slightly as they held a bouquet of white roses tied with satin ribbon. Charles awaited her at the arbor, his expression one of awe and adoration as his bride approached. The ceremony was everything a Southern wedding of distinction should be: elegant, traditional, and deeply rooted in Christian values. The minister, Reverend Thomas Hathaway, who had baptized both Thornfield daughters and was a close friend of the family, spoke at length about the sanctity of marriage and the duties of husband and wife. His resonant voice carried across the garden as he expounded on passages from Ephesians and Corinthians, emphasizing the sacred bond being formed before God and the assembled witnesses. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed on trembling fingers, and finally Charles was permitted to lift Elizabeth's veil and seal their union with a kiss. The assembled guests applauded as Reverend Hathaway presented Mr. and Mrs. Charles Montgomery to society for the first time. As the newlyweds led the procession back up the aisle, something caught Catherine's attention. A figure standing at the edge of the garden, partially obscured by the shadow of a large oak tree. She glimpsed only his profile, but she was certain it was James Barrett watching the ceremony from a distance. His tall, slender form was unmistakable, as was the solemn expression on what little she could see of his face. When she turned to point him out to her mother, however, the figure was gone, leaving Catherine to wonder if her imagination had conjured him from the morning's conversation. Following the ceremony, guests moved into the ballroom for the reception. The space had been transformed for the occasion, with floral arrangements on every table and swaths of white satin draped from the ceiling to create a tent-like effect. Servants circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres while the string quartet played selections from Mozart and Bach. The Thornfields had hired a photographer from Little Rock, an expensive luxury in 1854, when photography was still relatively new and primarily limited to studio portraits. This photographer, Mr. Nathaniel Harper, had brought his cumbersome equipment to capture images of the wedding party. A progressive choice that reflected Judge Thornfield's embrace of modern technology and his desire to document his family's important moments for posterity. Photography in 1854 was nothing like the instantaneous process we know today. Creating a daguerreotype required subjects to remain perfectly still for extended periods while the image was exposed on a silver-plated copper sheet. The process was time-consuming and resulted in a single non-reproducible image. The chemicals involved were often dangerous, particularly the mercury vapor used in developing the plates, which had been known to cause illness or even death among photographers who failed to take proper precautions. The wedding party gathered on the grand staircase of Willow Creek Manor for the photograph. The staircase with its polished mahogany banister and elegant curves provided a natural staging area that allowed Harper to arrange the family in an aesthetically pleasing formation. Elizabeth and Charles stood at the center with Judge and Mrs. Thornfield to their right and Charles's parents, the Montgomerys, to their left. Arranged around them were siblings, cousins, and the maid of honor and best man. Mr. Harper, a thin man with stained fingers and a perpetually furrowed brow, disappeared beneath the black cloth. Behind his camera, making adjustments to his equipment with practiced movements, he prepared the chemical plates, coating them with the light-sensitive materials that would capture the image of the wedding party. Finally ready, he emerged from behind the camera to give final instructions to his subjects. "No one move," Harper called out as he removed the lens cap to begin the exposure. Not a muscle, not an eyelid. The slightest movement will blur the image beyond recovery. The wedding party froze in place, maintaining their smiles despite the strain. Holding a pose for a Jerry type was no small feat. Muscles HDHD, eyes watered, and the temptation to shift position or scratch an itch became nearly overwhelming as the seconds ticked by. Children were particularly difficult to photograph, which was why most Jiraiya types of youngsters showed them seated on a parent's lap, the adult's firm grip ensuring stillness. And it was during this minute of perfect stillness that Catherine Thornfield, positioned at the edge of the group, noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Standing at the back of the gathering, partially obscured by Charles's younger brother, was James Barrett. His gaunt face bore the same solemn expression she had glimpsed at the edge of the garden during the ceremony. He stood perfectly still, more motionless than anyone else in the group, his eyes fixed not on the camera, but on Elizabeth. Catherine nearly gasped, but caught herself, remembering the photographer's strict instructions not to move. How had Barrett joined the photograph without anyone noticing? She was certain he hadn't been part of the group when they assembled on the staircase. Yet, there he was, as real and solid as any other person in the wedding party. As soon as Mr. Harper announced the exposure was complete and everyone relaxed, Catherine turned to confront Barrett, but he was nowhere to be seen. She scanned the faces in the wedding party, confusion mounting as she realized no one else seemed to have noticed his presence. "Did anyone see Mr. Barrett just now?" she asked, her voice slightly higher than normal. During the photograph, her question was met with blank stares and shaking heads. Several guests looked around as if expecting to see Barrett somewhere in the vicinity. He wasn't at the ceremony, Elizabeth said, smoothing her skirts as she descended the stairs. Perhaps he's taken ill or had to return to Boston unexpectedly. Catherine frowned. "But I saw him. He was standing right there during the photograph." She pointed to the spot where Barrett had stood, now occupied only by empty air. Judge Thornfield placed a reassuring hand on his younger daughter's shoulder. "The strain of the day must be affecting you, my dear. Barrett wasn't here. I would have noticed." Catherine knew what she had seen, but she also knew the futility of arguing with her father. She nodded and forced a smile, not wishing to disrupt her sister's special day with talk of phantom guests. Perhaps she had been mistaken. The stress of the wedding, combined with the morning's discussion about Barrett's absence, might have caused her to imagine his presence. Yet, the chill she had felt seemed so real, so distinct from the warm September air that filled the manor. The reception continued well into the evening. The grand ballroom, illuminated by hundreds of candles and the crystal chandeliers overhead, became increasingly warm as guests danced and conversed. The newlyweds shared their first dance to music provided by the string quartet from New Orleans. Their movements graceful and practiced, the result of years of dancing lessons and social events where proper form was essential. Champagne flowed freely. Toasts were offered to the couple's health and happiness. And the elaborate wedding cake, a towering creation of white icing and sugar flowers, was cut and distributed among the guests. The cake itself was a marvel of culinary artistry, having required 3 days of preparation by the manor's cook and her assistants. Each tier represented months of a marriage. The bottom tier dense and rich for the foundation of their life together. The middle tiers lighter and sweeter for the joys to come, and the top tier traditionally saved for the christening of the first child, wrapped carefully to preserve it for that future celebration. Throughout the celebrations, Catherine found herself scanning the crowd for any sign of James Barrett, but the mysterious man remained absent. Eventually, she convinced herself that she must have been mistaken. Perhaps it had been another guest who bore a resemblance to Barrett. Or perhaps the play of light and shadow on the staircase had created an illusion that her mind had interpreted as the missing guest. As midnight approached, Elizabeth and Charles departed amid a shower of rice and well-wishes, climbing into a carriage that would take them to a steamboat waiting on the Arkansas River. The carriage, polished to a high gleam and decorated with white ribbons and flowers, was drawn by 4 matching white horses, a display of luxury that befitted the union of 2 prominent families. The steamboat would carry them to New Orleans for their honeymoon, a journey of luxury and romance befitting their status. Catherine watched the carriage disappear down the long drive of Willow Creek Manor. A sense of melancholy settling over her as she contemplated the changes this marriage would bring to her relationship with her sister. Elizabeth would return as Mrs. Montgomery, mistress of her own household in Little Rock. Her priorities and loyalties shifted. The close companionship the sisters had shared throughout childhood would inevitably change, transformed by distance and new responsibilities. As the guests began to depart, Catherine retreated to her bedchamber, exhausted by the day's events and still troubled by her vision of James Barrett. As she prepared for bed, she found herself glancing repeatedly at the corner of her room, half expecting to see the tall, gaunt figure watching her from the shadows. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, her dreams were filled with images of Barrett standing on the staircase, his hollow eyes fixed not on the camera, but on her sister, his expression one of profound sadness. 2 weeks later, Mr. Harper arrived at Willow Creek Manor with a finished gerape from the wedding. The creation of a gerape was a complex process requiring careful handling of dangerous chemicals and precise timing at each stage. The silver-plated copper sheet had to be polished to a mirror finish, sensitized with iodine vapor, exposed in the camera, developed with mercury vapor, and finally fixed to make the image permanent. Each step presented opportunities for failure, which explained the high cost of photographic services in 1854. Judge Thornfield invited his family into the drawing room for the unveiling of what would become a treasured family heirloom. Margaret and Catherine gathered on the settee, their expressions reflecting both excitement and apprehension. Catherine still haunted by what she had seen during the exposure, uncertain what the finished image might reveal. Harper removed the protective case and revealed the image. A remarkably clear capture of the wedding party, each face distinct despite the lengthy exposure time. The daguerreotype was housed in a velvet-lined case with a gold-embossed cover. The craftsmanship of the container matching the artistry of the image it protected. When viewed from the correct angle, the silver surface revealed a positive image. With extraordinary detail, the intricate lace of Elizabeth's gown, the polished buttons of Charles's waistcoat, even the pattern of the carpet on the staircase where they stood. The Thornfields gathered around, examining the daguerreotype with expressions of delight. "Exquisite work, Mr. Harper," Judge Thornfield declared, reaching for his wallet to pay the agreed-upon sum. "You've captured the essence of the day perfectly." But Catherine wasn't listening. Her attention was fixed on the image, specifically on a figure standing at the back of the group, James Barrett. Just as she had seen during the exposure, he was positioned behind Charles's brother, his expression solemn, his eyes seemingly focused directly on the camera. There was no mistaking him. The hollow cheeks, the penetrating gaze, the formal attire identical to what he had worn at the rehearsal dinner. "Father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look, it's Mr. Barrett." Judge Thornfield frowned, leaning closer to examine the DGER type. The drawing room fell silent as he studied the image, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered. Barrett wasn't present for the photograph, but there he was, unmistakable in the image. As clear and distinct as any other member of the wedding party. The gerape, with its silver surface that could not be altered or manipulated once fixed, provided irrefutable evidence that James Barrett had been present during the exposure, standing among the Thornfields and Montgomerys on the grand staircase. "I don't understand," Margaret Thornfield said, her face paling as she too recognized the figure. "How could he be in the photograph if he wasn't there?" Mr. Harper, sensing the family's distress, peered at the image. "Sometimes, madam, if a person moves during the exposure, they can appear as a blur or a transparent figure. But this gentleman appears quite solid and clear. He must have been standing very still." "He wasn't there," Judge Thornfield insisted, his voice rising slightly. "Everyone in this room knows he wasn't there." An uncomfortable silence fell over the drawing room. The rational, scientific understanding that formed the foundation of Judge Thornfield's worldview could not account for what they were seeing. A man who had not been physically present during the photograph now appeared in the finished image, as solid and real as any other figure captured by Harper's camera. Finally, Catherine spoke the words everyone was thinking, but no one dared say, "Unless he was there, but somehow only I could see him." The implication hung in the air that something beyond the natural world had manifested itself on the staircase of Willow Creek Manor, visible to Catherine's eyes and Harper's camera, but invisible to everyone else present. It was a suggestion that challenged the very fabric of reality as the Thornfields understood it. A concept more at home in folklore than in the drawing room of an educated modern family in 1854. The Thornfields were not a family inclined toward superstition. Judge William Thornfield prided himself on his rational mind and scientific understanding. He had read widely in the emerging fields of geology and biology, kept abreast of developments in physics and chemistry, and dismissed the folk beliefs that persisted among the less educated population of Arkansas as remnants of a more ignorant age. He believed in a world governed by natural laws, a universe that, while created by God, operated according to principles that could be discovered and understood through observation and reason. He dismissed Catherine's suggestion outright, insisting there must be a logical explanation for Barrett's appearance in the photograph. "Perhaps he slipped into the group at the last moment without our noticing," the judge reasoned, pacing before the fireplace as he attempted to reconcile the evidence before him with his understanding of reality. "Or maybe Harper has made some mistake with his chemicals, creating an aberration that merely resembles our absent guest." But Mr. Harper, offended by the suggestion of incompetence, defended his work vigorously. "I assure you, sir, this gerotype was created with the utmost care and precision. There are no mistakes or aberrations. Every figure captured in this image was present during the exposure." He gestured toward the gerotype with a mixture of professional pride and growing unease. "The camera does not lie, Judge Thornfield. It cannot invent figures that were not there." In the days that followed, Judge Thornfield made inquiries about James Barrett, sending Letters to contacts in Boston attempting to locate the man who had so mysteriously appeared in and disappeared from his daughter's wedding. He wrote to colleagues at Harvard, to business associates with connections in New England, and to distant relatives who might have encountered Barrett in Boston society. The responses he received only deepened the mystery. None of his Boston acquaintances knew of a James Barrett matching the description provided. There was no record of such a man in the city directories, no mention of him in society columns or business registries. Furthermore, Margaret's family, when consulted about this supposed distant cousin, denied any knowledge of such a relation. Her father, in a letter that betrayed his concern for his daughter's mental well-being, assured Judge Thornfield that there were no Barretts among their extended family, and certainly none who had relocated to Boston. It was as if James Barrett had appeared from nowhere, attended the rehearsal dinner, vanished before the ceremony, somehow appeared in the wedding photograph, and then disappeared completely. The rational explanations. The judge had proposed that Barrett was an opportunist who had crashed the wedding by claiming a false family connection, or that he was a business associate of one of the guests who had been mistakenly introduced as a relation. Failed to account for his appearance in the Jerape when no one but Catherine had seen him present during the exposure. The Gerara itself became an object of both fascination and unease for the Thornfield family. Judge Thornfield considered destroying it, uncomfortable with the inexplicable presence it contained. But Margaret insisted on preserving it as a record of their daughter's wedding day. Eventually, they reached a compromise. The Jerape would be displayed in the family's private quarters rather than in the public rooms of Willow Creek Manor, where it might prompt questions from visitors about the solemn-faced man standing at the back of the group. 6 months passed and the incident of the mysterious wedding guest gradually faded from the family's daily conversations. Though it remained an unsettling memory, Elizabeth and Charles had settled into married life in Little Rock, where Charles had taken a position at his father's bank. Their letters home spoke of happiness and plans for the future, with no mention of strange occurrences or unwelcome guests. Judge Thornfield, while never admitting it openly, had begun to consider the possibility that there might be aspects of existence that defied his rational understanding. Forces or phenomena that operated according to laws not yet discovered by science. In the spring of 1855, another wedding was announced. Catherine Thornfield was to marry Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, a promising young officer from a respected Virginia family whom she had met at her sister's wedding. Despite being only 18, Catherine had captured the lieutenant's heart with her practical nature and quiet intelligence, so different from her sister's more vivacious personality, yet equally compelling. After a brief courtship conducted largely through correspondence, he had proposed during a leave from his posting at Fort Smith. The wedding was scheduled for June, and once again, Willow Creek Manor was transformed for a celebration. Though not quite as elaborate as Elizabeth's wedding, Catherine had always preferred simplicity to her sister's love of grandeur. It promised to be a beautiful event, bringing together the Thornfield and Bradford families along with the elite of Arkansas society. Lieutenant Bradford was 24, a West Point graduate with a distinguished record that suggested a promising military career ahead. Tall and lean with brown hair kept short in military fashion and green eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He presented a striking figure in his dress uniform. His manner was reserved but warm, his conversation thoughtful rather than showy, and his obvious devotion to Catherine had quickly won over the Thornfields, despite initial concerns about the distance his military career might place between their daughter and her family. Elizabeth and Charles returned to Elmwood for the occasion. Elizabeth, now visibly with child, expecting the first Thornfield grandchild in the autumn. The prospect of a new generation brought joy to the family, temporarily overshadowing the unsettling memory of James Barrett and his inexplicable appearance in Elizabeth's wedding photograph. The family's focus had shifted to the future. Catherine's marriage, Elizabeth's child, the continuation of the Thornfield legacy through new branches of the family tree. The night before Catherine's wedding, a rehearsal. Dinner was held in the manor's dining room. The same crystal chandeliers that had illuminated Elizabeth's celebration now cast their warm glow over a smaller but no less distinguished gathering. The Bradfords, having traveled from Virginia, were being introduced to the Thornfield circle of friends and associates. Lieutenant Bradford's parents, a judge like William Thornfield, and his wife, a renowned hostess in Richmond society, found much in common with their future in-laws. The two families bonding over shared values and similar social positions despite the geographical distance that separated them. As toasts were being offered to the bride and groom, Elizabeth nudged her husband and whispered, "Charles, who is that man by the window, the one in the dark suit?" Charles followed her gaze, but saw only empty space beside the long velvet drapes that framed the dining room windows. "What man, my dear? There's no one standing there." Elizabeth frowned, rubbing her eyes. "How strange. I could have sworn I saw someone. A tall, thin man watching us. He reminded me of that odd Mr. Barrett from our wedding." The mention of Barrett's name sent a chill through Elizabeth that had nothing to do with the evening breeze coming through the open window. She had been present when the geretype was unveiled, had seen with her own eyes the impossible figure standing among the wedding party, though she had not experienced Catherine's vision during the exposure itself. The evidence of the photograph had been impossible to dismiss, and in the month since, she had found herself occasionally glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see Barrett's gaunt figure watching her from a distance. Charles patted his wife's hand reassuringly. "It's just the fatigue of travel in your condition, my love. The doctor said you should rest as much as possible." Elizabeth nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Throughout the remainder of the evening, she occasionally glanced toward the window, but the figure did not reappear. By the time the dinner concluded and the guests retired for the night, she had almost convinced herself that Charles was right, that the strain of travel combined with her pregnancy had caused her to imagine a figure where none existed. Catherine's wedding day arrived, blessed with perfect June weather. Warm sunshine, tempered by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of roses through the gardens of Willow Creek Manor. The ceremony was to be held in the same location as Elizabeth's wedding, beneath the arbor, now covered with summer blooms rather than the white roses of September. Catherine, practical even in her wedding plans, had chosen to follow the path her sister had established, seeing no reason to create new arrangements when the previous ones had been so successful. Her wedding dress, though similar in style to Elizabeth's, reflected Catherine's simpler tastes. The silk was unadorned, except for a delicate border of lace at the cuffs and hem, and her veil was shorter and less elaborate than her sister's had been. Her bouquet consisted of wild flowers gathered from the meadows surrounding Willow Creek Manor, tied with a simple ribbon rather than the elaborate arrangement Elizabeth had carried. Yet in her understated elegance, Catherine was every bit as beautiful as her sister had been, her quiet confidence lending her a grace that drew admiring glances from the assembled guests. Elizabeth, too far along in her pregnancy to serve as matron of honor, sat in the front row beside Charles. Her condition had limited her involvement in the wedding preparations, though she had offered advice and support to her younger sister throughout the planning process. Now, as the music began and the wedding party processed down the aisle, Elizabeth felt a chill despite the warm day. Turning slightly, she glanced over her shoulder, and there he was, James Barrett, standing at the back of the assembled guests, his expression solemn, his eyes fixed on the bride. Elizabeth clutched Charles's arm. "He's here," she whispered urgently. "Who, my dear?" "Barrett, the man from our wedding. He's standing right there at the back." Charles turned to look but shook his head. Elizabeth, there's no one there. Just the rose trellis and the oak tree beyond. Elizabeth looked again, but Barrett was gone. The space where he had stood was empty, occupied only by dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves of the ancient oak. She spent the remainder of the ceremony in a state of anxious vigilance, constantly scanning the gathering for any sign of the mysterious man who had appeared in her wedding photograph and now apparently at her sister's wedding as well. Following the ceremony, the wedding party assembled on the grand staircase once again for photographs. Mr. Harper, who had been so pleased with his work at Elizabeth's wedding that he offered a reduced rate for Catherine's, prepared his equipment with practice efficiency. The chemical plates were prepared, the camera positioned at the optimal angle to capture the gathering, and the wedding party arranged in an aesthetically pleasing formation. Catherine and Lieutenant Bradford at the center with their respective families arranged around them. As the exposure began and everyone held perfectly still, Elizabeth, positioned beside her mother, felt that same inexplicable chill she had experienced during the ceremony. From the corner of her eye, the only movement she dared make during the exposure, she glimpsed a dark figure standing at the edge of the group. James Barrett had somehow joined the photograph once again, his tall, gaunt form unmistakable, even in her peripheral vision. When Harper announced the exposure complete, and everyone relaxed their positions, Elizabeth immediately turned to confront the intruder. But as before, there was no sign of him. The space where she had seen him standing was empty, occupied only by the patterned wallpaper of the entrance hall, visible through the open door beyond the staircase. She grabbed her father's arm. "Father, he was here again." "Barrett, he was in the photograph." Judge Thornfield's expression darkened. After 6 months of fruitless inquiries and sleepless nights spent trying to reconcile the evidence of the Gerre-type with his rational understanding of the world, the last thing he wanted was a revival of the Barrett mystery on what should be a joyous occasion for his younger daughter. "Elizabeth, please, not today. Your sister deserves her happiness without this nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Elizabeth insisted, her voice low but intense. "I saw him just as Catherine saw him at my wedding. He's appearing in our family photographs." The judge led his eldest daughter away from the group, guiding her into the relative privacy of the drawing room. He closed the door behind them before turning to face Elizabeth, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "Listen to me, Elizabeth. There is no James Barrett. There never was. The man at your rehearsal dinner was likely some opportunist who heard of the wedding and presented himself as a relation to gain entry to our home. As for the photograph, we'll see when Harper delivers it, but I will not have you upsetting your sister or your mother with talk of ghosts or apparitions." Elizabeth recognized the futility of arguing with her father. She nodded reluctantly and rejoined the celebration, though she remained uneasy throughout the day. The rest of the wedding reception passed without incident. The meal was served, toasts were offered, and Catherine and Lieutenant Bradford departed in the early evening for a honeymoon in Virginia, where they would visit his family before returning to his posting at Fort Smith. 2 weeks later, Mr. Harper delivered the finished daguerreotype of Catherine's wedding party. Once again, the Thornfields gathered in the drawing room just as they had 6 months earlier, though this time there was an undercurrent of tension as the image was unveiled. Judge Thornfield had prepared himself for the possibility that Barrett might appear in this photograph as well, though he had not shared this concern with his wife or daughters. Judge Thornfield was the first to examine the photograph, his expression revealing nothing as his eyes scanned the captured scene. Without a word, he passed the gerrape to his wife, who gasped softly before handing it to Elizabeth. And there he was, James Barrett, standing at the edge of the group in exactly the position where Elizabeth had glimpsed him during the exposure. His appearance was identical to how he had looked in the photograph from Elizabeth's wedding. The same solemn expression, the same dark suit, the same penetrating gaze. Directed at the camera. "This is impossible," Judge Thornfield muttered, his scientific rationality challenged by the evidence before him. 6 months of investigation had yielded no explanation for Barrett's appearance in the first photograph, and now here he was again, defying natural laws and rational understanding. Catherine examining the image over Elizabeth's shoulder pad visibly. "It's him, the man I saw at your wedding, Elizabeth, but how can he be in both our photographs when no one saw him?" Mr. Harper, who had remained silent during the family's examination, finally spoke. "If I may, Judge Thornfield, I've heard tales of similar phenomena. Some believe the camera can capture what the human eye cannot. Spirits or entities that exist beyond our normal perception." Judge Thornfield scoffed. "Superstitious. Nonsense, Harper. There must be a rational explanation." "Perhaps," Harper conceded, removing his spectacles and polishing them with a handkerchief. A gesture that gave him time to consider his words carefully. "But I've been a photographer for nearly 15 years since the Gere type was first introduced to America. In that time, I've witnessed strange appearances and photographs that cannot be explained by science as we understand it." He replaced his spectacles and leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering as if sharing a professional secret. "The silver and chemicals we use to create these images. They're sensitive to more than just light. Judge Thornfield. There have been cases where daguerreotypes have captured figures or objects not visible to those present during the exposure. Some call it spirit photography, though I prefer not to use such sensational terms." Judge Thornfield dismissed Harper shortly thereafter, paying him for his services, but making it clear that his theories about supernatural photography were unwelcome. Once the photographer had departed, William Thornfield addressed his family. "I want no more discussion of this Barrett character or these anomalies in our family photographs. Such talk leads only to unnecessary fear and superstition. There is surely a logical explanation, and until we discover it, we will simply accept that our wedding daguerreotypes have this peculiarity." Despite the judge's decree, the mysterious appearances of James Barrett became the subject of hushed conversations among the Thornfield women. Elizabeth, who returned to Little Rock with Charles after Catherine's wedding, wrote frequently to her sister. Their letters often turning to speculation about the strange man who had appeared in both their wedding photographs, yet remained invisible to most during the actual events. Elizabeth, whose pregnancy had entered its final months, found herself increasingly troubled by dreams of Barrett. In these dreams, he stood at the foot of her bed, his expression sorrowful as he reached toward her swollen belly. She would wake from these dreams, bathed in cold sweat, clutching her abdomen protectively, convinced that Barrett's ghostly presence had somehow followed her to Little Rock. In September 1855, Elizabeth gave birth to a son, William Charles Montgomery, named for both grandfathers. The delivery was difficult, but ultimately successful, and both mother and child emerged healthy from the ordeal. Charles sent telegrams to both families announcing the birth, and preparations were made for the christening, which would bring the Thornfields and Montgomerys together once again to celebrate the newest member of their connected families. The joyous occasion temporarily overshadowed the families' unease about the Barrett mystery. Judge and Mrs. Thornfield traveled to Little Rock for their grandson's christening, bringing Catherine and her new husband with them. Lieutenant Bradford had received a brief leave from his duties at Fort Smith specifically for the occasion, a testament to his growing reputation in military circles. The christening was held at the Episcopal Church in Little Rock, followed by a reception at Elizabeth and Charles' home, a handsome brick residence near the bank where Charles worked. Its elegant furnishings and spacious rooms reflecting the prosperity of the Montgomery family. A photographer was hired to capture images of the baby with his family, a luxury that reflected the Montgomerys' prosperity and desire to document their growing family. The photographer, a Mr. Wilson of Little Rock, was not familiar with the Thornfield family's unusual history with daguerreotypes. He set up his equipment in the parlor of the Montgomery home, arranging the family for a group portrait. Elizabeth holding baby William, with Charles beside her and the grandparents gathered around. Catherine stood to one side with Lieutenant Bradford, completing the family circle around the infant who represented the union of the Thornfield and Montgomery lines. As the photographer arranged the family for a group portrait, Elizabeth, holding baby William with Charles beside her and the grandparents gathered around, Catherine suddenly felt the now familiar chill that had preceded Barrett's appearances. She scanned the room but saw no sign of the mysterious man. The photographer ducked beneath his cloth, prepared the plate, and instructed everyone to remain still. The exposure began, and for nearly a minute, the family maintained their positions, expressions fixed in proud smiles. Despite the strain, when the photographer emerged and announced the exposure complete, Catherine immediately questioned her sister. "Did you feel it? That strange cold sensation?" Elizabeth nodded slightly, careful not to disturb the baby sleeping in her arms. "Yes, just before the exposure began." "You don't think?" "We'll know when the photograph is developed," Catherine replied grimly. A week later, when the photographer delivered the finished daguerreotype, their fears were confirmed. There, standing behind Judge Thornfield's shoulder, was James Barrett. The same hollow-shaped figure, the same penetrating gaze, the same dark suit he had worn in both wedding photographs. This time, however, something was different. Barrett's gaze was not directed at the camera as it had been previously. Instead, he appeared to be looking directly at the infant in Elizabeth's arms. His expression, a mixture of sadness and what might have been longing, the appearance of Barrett in what was now 3 family photographs, could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or photographic anomaly. Judge Thornfield, his scientific rationality severely tested, finally agreed to investigate the matter more thoroughly. If this is some elaborate hoax, he declared to his family, gathered once more in the parlor of Elizabeth and Charles's home, I will uncover it. If not, well, there must be some explanation for why this man, whoever he may be, appears in our family photographs. The judge's investigation began with a more extensive inquiry into the name James Barrett, no longer limiting his search to his own acquaintances in Boston. He engaged the services of a private investigator recommended by a fellow judge in Boston. Letters were sent to contacts throughout the eastern seaboard and as far west as St. Louis, seeking information about anyone matching Barrett's description who might have a connection to the Thornfield or Montgomery families. 4 months, responses trickled in, most containing no useful information. The private investigator reported that no James Barrett matching the description had been recorded in Boston city directories for the past decade. Churches had no record of his baptism or marriage. Cemeteries had no record of his burial. It was as if the man had never existed or had somehow been erased from official records. Then in early 1856, a letter arrived from a former colleague of the judge who had relocated to Boston years earlier. The contents of this letter would shift the course of the investigation dramatically. "My dear William," the letter began, "your inquiry about a James Barrett has yielded some rather disturbing information. There was indeed a man by that name in Boston who matches your description. Tall, slender, with hollow cheeks and an intense gaze. However, this James Barrett died in the winter of 1852, more than 2 years before your daughter's wedding, where you claimed to have met him." The letter went on to explain that Barrett had been a prominent photographer in Boston, one of the first to master the Barrett process after it was introduced to America. His studio on Washington Street had been patronized by the city's elite who sought his services for portraits and family photographs. He had been known for his exceptional skill and the unusual clarity of his images, which some attributed to special chemical formulations he had developed himself. Barrett's death was somewhat mysterious. The letter continued, he was found in his studio, slumped over his camera. The medical examiner concluded he had been poisoned by the mercury vapors used in developing daguerreotypes, a common hazard of the profession. However, rumors circulated that Barrett had been experimenting with unusual techniques in his final days, attempts to capture images of the recently deceased, believing his camera could somehow bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The letter concluded with a postscript that sent a chill through Judge Thornfield. I've enclosed a small advertisement I found in a newspaper from 1851 announcing Barrett's photographic services. The image it contains may be of interest. The judge unfolded the brittle newspaper clipping that had been enclosed with the letter. It was a simple advertisement for Barrett's Barrett studio, promising portraits of unparalleled clarity and lifelike quality. In the corner of the advertisement was a small image, a self-portrait of the photographer himself. The face that looked back at Judge Thornfield from the yellowed paper was unmistakable. The hollow cheeks, the intense eyes, the solemn expression. It was the same man who had appeared in 3 Thornfield family photographs. The same man who had introduced himself as James Barrett at Elizabeth's rehearsal dinner. Judge Thornfield read this letter alone in his study. The implications of its contents too disturbing to immediately share with his family. If the James Barrett who had attended Elizabeth's rehearsal dinner and appeared in 3 family photographs was the same James Barrett who had died in Boston in 1852, then they were dealing with something beyond the judge's scientific understanding, something that challenged his fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality and existence. For several days, William Thornfield wrestled with this information, attempting to reconcile it with his rational worldview. Perhaps the Boston James Barrett was not the same man. Perhaps his correspondent was mistaken about the date of Barrett's death. Perhaps the entire situation was an elaborate hoax perpetrated by someone with unknown motives. Though who would have the resources or reason to create such a complex deception remained unclear, but deep down the judge knew none of these explanations was satisfactory. He had seen Barrett with his own eyes at the rehearsal dinner, had conversed with him, shaken his hand. The man had been physically present, not some apparition or trick of the light. Yet he had also appeared in photographs when no one or only certain family members could see him present during the exposure. The judge found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to consider explanations that existed outside the boundaries of his scientific understanding, that perhaps there were aspects of existence that defied rational explanation, forces, or phenomena that operated according to laws not yet discovered by human investigation. Finally, Judge Thornfield shared the letter and newspaper clipping with his wife and daughters. They gathered once again in the drawing room of Willow Creek Manor, the space that had witnessed the unveiling of both wedding daguerreotypes. Their reactions ranged from frightened Margaret to grimly vindicated Catherine to deeply concerned Elizabeth, who was now expecting her second child. "What does it mean, Father?" Elizabeth asked, one hand resting protectively on her growing belly. "Why would the ghost of a Boston photographer appear at our family weddings and my son's christening?" The judge shook his head. "I don't know that I accept this supernatural explanation, but I cannot deny the evidence before us. Something extraordinary is occurring, and it seems to be focused on our family's significant moments." Catherine, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the discussion, finally spoke. "There's something else, something I noticed but didn't mention before. She retrieved the daguerreotypes of both weddings and the christening, laying them side by side on the table. Look at his eyes in each image. In Elizabeth's wedding photograph, he's looking directly at the camera. In mine, his gaze is shifted slightly toward Elizabeth. And in the christening photograph, he's looking at William. Elizabeth finished, a chill running through her as she recognized the truth of her sister's observation. It's as if he's following something through our family, Catherine continued. Something that passed from Elizabeth to her son. The implication hung in the air that Barrett's spirit was somehow attached not to a place but to a bloodline following the Thornfield genetic inheritance as it passed from generation to generation. But why? What connection could a Boston photographer who died in 1852 have to an Arkansas family he had never known in life? The implications of Catherine's observation hung heavy in the air. If Barrett's ghostly presence was indeed following something through the Thornfield family line, what was it? And more importantly, why? Judge Thornfield, despite his reluctance to embrace supernatural explanations, decided to consult someone with knowledge of such matters. Though the judge was a devoted Christian who attended Episcopal services every Sunday, he recognized that some phenomena existed in the shadowy areas beyond mainstream religious understanding. Folk beliefs and practices that, while dismissed by educated society, persisted among those who claimed to have witnessed or experienced events that defied rational explanation. Through discreet inquiries, he learned of a woman named Madame Lavo, who lived in a small cabin outside Elmwood, rumored to be the daughter of a Louisiana voodoo priestess who had moved to Arkansas after her marriage to a local farmer. She had a reputation for communicating with spirits and understanding the mysteries that existed between the world of the living and the dead. The local population sought her services for everything from locating lost objects to communicating with departed loved ones, though they did so quietly away from the disapproving eyes of church authorities. Under normal circumstances, William Thornfield would never have associated with someone of Madame Lavo's reputation. His position as a judge required him to maintain the respect of the community, and consulting a woman widely regarded as a practitioner of voodoo would undoubtedly damage his standing if it became known. But these were not normal circumstances, and his concern for his family, particularly his grandson and Elizabeth's unborn child, outweighed his social considerations. On a grey March afternoon in 1856, Judge Thornfield rode alone to Madame Lavo's cabin. He left Willow Creek Manor without informing Margaret of his destination, saying only that he had business to attend to in town. The cabin stood in a clearing surrounded by ancient cypress trees, their moss-draped branches creating a natural barrier between Madame Lavo's domain and the outside world. A small garden of unfamiliar herbs grew beside the cabin, and wind chimes made of bones and shells hung from the low porch roof, creating an eerie melody in the breeze. The woman who greeted him was not what he expected, neither very old nor dressed in exotic garments, but a handsome woman of middle years with intelligent eyes and a direct manner of speaking. Her skin was the color of polished mahogany, her hair covered with a simple white cloth, and her dress was plain but clean. Only the numerous amulets and charms that hung around her neck suggested her unconventional profession. "I've been expecting you, Judge Thornfield," she said as she opened her door to him. "The spirits have been restless lately." Speaking of disturbances at Willow Creek Manor, the judge, unsettled by her apparent foreknowledge of his visit, followed her into the cabin's single room. The interior was surprisingly ordinary. Clean and well-kept, with herbs hanging from the rafters to dry, and a small altar in one corner bearing candles and unfamiliar objects. A fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and the scent of unfamiliar incense hung in the air. Without preamble, William Thornfield placed the 3 daguerreotypes on Madame Lavo's table. "There is a man appearing in my family's photographs who should not be There. I need to understand why. Madame Lavo examined each image carefully, her fingers hovering above the surface without touching it, as if she could feel something emanating from the silver plates. Her expression grew more troubled with each one, her brow furrowing as she studied Barrett's face in the christening photograph. Finally, she looked up at the judge, her eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and curiosity. This man was a photographer in life, she stated rather than asked. Yes, James Barrett of Boston. He died in 1852. Madame Lavo nodded slowly, unsurprised by this information. Yet he appeared physically at your daughter's wedding rehearsal in 1854. And now he appears in these images, visible only to the camera and certain members of your family. My daughters can sometimes sense his presence. They feel a chill when he's near. The sensitivity runs in your bloodline. Then particularly through the women, Madame Lavo observed. This spirit, this James Barrett, is bound to your family somehow. Not to the Thornfield name itself, but to something within your bloodline. But why? The judge demanded, his hands flat on the table as he leaned forward. We had no connection to Barrett in life. None of us had even heard of him before he appeared at Elizabeth's wedding. Madame Lavo closed her eyes, passing her hands slowly over the gerotypes. For several minutes, she remained silent, her breathing becoming deeper and more rhythmic. The room seemed to grow darker despite the afternoon sun outside, and the judge felt a chill similar to what his daughters had described, a cold that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from within his own body. When she finally opened her eyes, they seemed darker, as if reflecting shadows not present in the cabin. He searches for something taken from him, she said, her voice altered slightly. Something precious that was stolen, that passes through blood that cannot be reclaimed but must be watched. He follows it through generations, unable to rest. Until she stopped abruptly, blinking as if waking from a trance. When she spoke again, her voice had returned to normal. Judge Thornfield, does your family possess anything that might have belonged to James Barrett? An heirloom perhaps, or an object acquired around the time of his death in 1852. The judge frowned, considering. Not that I'm aware of. We've never had connections to Boston until my son-in-law attended Harvard several years ago. Think carefully, Madame Lavo urged. Sometimes objects pass through families without their origins being known. A piece of jewelry, a book, a photograph. Anything that might have once belonged to Barrett. William Thornfield shook his head. Nothing comes to mind, but I'll discuss it with Margaret and my daughters. Perhaps one of them will remember something. As the judge prepared to leave, Madame Lavo offered one final piece of advice. Barrett's spirit is not malevolent, Judge Thornfield. He does not wish harm to your family, but his presence suggests unfinished business. A wrong that needs righting or a truth that needs revealing. Until that occurs, I fear he will continue to appear at significant moments in your family's history, following whatever it is that binds him to your bloodline. She wrapped the gerotypes carefully in a piece of black cloth before returning them to the judge. Keep these safe. They are more than mere images now. They are connections between your world and his. And Judge Thornfield, she added as he reached the door. When you discover what binds Barrett to your family, you may find it challenges everything you believe about the nature of life and death. The judge returned to Willow Creek Manor, troubled by his conversation with Madame Lavo. While he was still reluctant to fully embrace supernatural explanations, he could no longer deny that something extraordinary was occurring, something that defied rational understanding. The evidence had accumulated beyond what could be dismissed as coincidence or misconception. Barrett's physical presence at the rehearsal dinner witnessed by multiple guests, his appearance in 3 separate daguerreotypes, the inexplicable cold that preceded his manifestations, and now the revelation that he had died years before his first encounter with the Thornfield family. That evening, he gathered his family in the drawing room: Margaret, Catherine, and her husband Thomas, who was home on leave from Fort Smith, and Elizabeth and Charles, who had traveled from Little Rock with their son, William, for a family visit. Judge Thornfield related his conversation with Madame Larveau, omitting only those details that might cause unnecessary alarm. "So, we need to determine if our family possesses something that once belonged to this photographer from Boston," he concluded. "Something acquired around or before 1852. The family sat in thoughtful silence, each mentally cataloguing possessions that might have a connection to Boston or to the mysterious James Barrett. Lieutenant Bradford, who had remained respectfully quiet during the judge's explanation, suggested that perhaps it was not an object, but a person, someone in the Thornfield lineage, who might have encountered Barrett during his lifetime. "Is it possible one of your ancestors sat for a portrait in Barrett's studio?" he asked. "Perhaps he formed some attachment to that person, and now his spirit follows their descendants." It was a reasonable suggestion. But Judge Thornfield shook his head. "The Thornfield family has been in Arkansas since the territory was established. None of our direct ancestors had connections to Boston." Margaret Thornfield, who had been listening with increasing distress, suddenly paused. "William," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The locket." All eyes turned to Margaret, who reached with trembling fingers for the gold locket she wore around her neck. A piece of jewelry so familiar to the family that it had become almost invisible, simply a part of Margaret that they took for granted. It was oval in shape, approximately the size of a small pocket watch, and hung from a delicate gold chain that complemented its antique craftsmanship. "This locket was given to me by my father in 1852, Margaret explained, unfastening it from around her neck. "He presented it to me on our last visit to Boston, saying he had acquired it from the estate of a recently deceased gentleman. The timing was too coincidental to dismiss. Barrett had died in Boston in 1852, and that same year, Margaret's father had purchased a locket from an estate sale in the same city. The connection that had eluded them for nearly 2 years suddenly seemed obvious. A thread linking the Thornfield family to the spectral photographer who haunted their significant moments. The locket was a beautiful piece, oval-shaped, made of gold with intricate engravings on its surface. The design featured intertwined vines and flowers executed with extraordinary craftsmanship that suggested European origin, perhaps French or Italian. Margaret rarely opened it, but now she did so, revealing what appeared to be a small piece of paper or parchment inside rather than the expected portrait miniature. "I've never understood what this is," Margaret admitted, carefully removing the small square from inside the locket. "It's not a portrait, yet it seemed important enough for someone to place inside this valuable locket." Judge Thornfield took the square from his wife's hand and examined it closely. It appeared to be a piece of specially treated paper similar to those used in the daguerreotype process, but smaller and without a visible image. The surface was slightly reflective, suggesting it had been treated with silver or another photosensitive material, but no picture was discernible on its surface. "This could be a photographic plate that was never fully developed," Charles suggested, drawing on knowledge gained during his education at Harvard, where he had taken an interest in the scientific advances of their age. "Or perhaps it was exposed, but the image has faded over time." Elizabeth, who had been watching the discussion while cradling her son, suddenly gasped. The baby's reaction when mother holds him. "Remember how he always reaches for the locket? We thought he was simply attracted to the shiny gold." But what if he's sensing something about this object that we cannot? Indeed, young William had developed a fascination with his grandmother's locket from his earliest days. Whenever Margaret held him, his tiny hands would reach for the golden oval that hung around her neck, his eyes fixed on it with an intensity unusual in an infant. The family had attributed this behavior to a baby's natural attraction to bright, shiny objects, but in light of Barrett's appearances, it took on a more significant meaning. The implications of Elizabeth's observation hung heavy in the room. If the locket had indeed belonged to James Barrett, and if it contained some unfinished photographic work of his, it might explain his ghostly appearances at family events, his spirit following this object that had once been precious to him. We need to know more about this locket, Judge Thornfield decided. Its origins, how it came into your father's possession, and most importantly, whether it truly belonged to James Barrett. The investigation into the locket's origins would prove challenging. Margaret's father had passed away in 1853, taking with him any specific knowledge of how he had acquired the piece. Letters to his former associates in Boston yielded little useful information, most responding that they had no recollection of the judge purchasing jewelry from any estate sale. The private investigator engaged by Judge Thornfield focused his efforts on tracing the locket's provenance, visiting auction houses and estate attorneys in Boston who might have records of items sold from Barrett's estate after his death. This line of inquiry proved more fruitful, yielding a catalogue from an auction held in March 1852, which listed among the items for sale one gold locket Italian craftsmanship containing experimental photographic plate from the estate of J. R. Barrett, photographer. This confirmation that the locket had indeed belonged to Barrett strengthened the connection between the object and the supernatural phenomena experienced by the Thornfield family. But it didn't explain why Barrett's spirit was so intent on following the locket or what significance the experimental photographic plate inside it might hold. Meanwhile, life continued for the Thornfield family. Elizabeth gave birth to her second child, a daughter named Margaret after her grandmother in the summer of 1856. No photographer was hired for the christening, the family having developed an understandable weariness about cameras and the images they might capture. But their caution didn't prevent James Barrett from making his presence known. During the christening ceremony, both Catherine and Elizabeth felt the now familiar chill, and Elizabeth glimpsed Barrett standing at the back of the church, his gaze fixed on the infant in her arms. His appearance was brief, a momentary manifestation visible only to Elizabeth, but it confirmed that avoiding photographers would not deter Barrett's spirit from witnessing significant events in the Thornfield family line. 2 years passed with no resolution to the mystery. The locket remained in a locked drawer in Judge Thornfield's study, removed from Margaret's neck in hopes that separating it from the family might somehow break Barrett's connection to them. But at every significant family event, birthdays, holidays, celebrations, someone would sense his presence or catch a glimpse of his solemn figure watching from a distance. In 1858, Catherine gave birth to her first child, a son named James Thomas Bradford. The name James was chosen to honor Thomas's father. But the coincidence of sharing a name with the spirit that haunted their family photographs was not lost on Catherine. During her pregnancy, she had experienced vivid dreams of James Barrett. Dreams in which he seemed to be trying to communicate something to her, something about the locket and its contents. In these dreams, Barrett stood in what appeared to be his photography studio in Boston, surrounded by cameras and chemical apparatus. He worked feverishly over a small object that glowed with an unnatural light, his expression a mixture of determination and desperation. Though he never spoke directly to Catherine in these dreams, she would wake with the distinct impression that he was trying to complete something left unfinished. Something connected to the locket now locked away in her father's study. The christening of young James Bradford brought the entire Thornfield family together once again at Willow Creek Manor. Despite their previous decision to avoid photographers, Catherine insisted on hiring one for the occasion. If Barrett's going to appear anyway, she reasoned, we might as well have a record of it. Perhaps there will be something in the image that helps us understand what he wants. Judge Thornfield reluctantly agreed, and Mr. Harper was summoned once more to Willow Creek Manor. The photographer, now aware of the strange phenomena associated with the family's photographs, approached the task with a mixture of professional detachment and personal curiosity. He had discussed the Thornfield case with colleagues in the growing field of spirit photography, practitioners who specifically attempted to capture images of the deceased in photographs with their living relatives. While Harper did not actively seek such images in his own work, he had developed an interest in the phenomenon and the scientific questions it raised about the nature of photography itself. As the family assembled for the portrait, Catherine holding baby James with Thomas beside her and the rest of the family gathered around, Elizabeth noticed something unusual. The locket, which had remained locked in her father's study for 2 years, was now hanging around her mother's neck once again. "Mother," Elizabeth whispered urgently. "Why are you wearing the locket?" Margaret Thornfield touched the gold oval at her throat. "Your father returned it to me this morning. He said, if Barrett is going to appear, regardless of our precautions, perhaps wearing the locket might prompt some change, some revelation about what he wants. It was a calculated risk, bringing the object that seemed to connect Barrett's spirit to the Thornfield family into direct contact with a photographic opportunity. Judge Thornfield had concluded that after years of uncertainty and spectral appearances, a more direct approach might yield results, might provide some insight into Barrett's purpose, or allow his spirit to communicate more clearly what it sought from the Thornfield family. Before Elizabeth could respond, Mr. Harper called for everyone's attention. The exposure was about to begin, and they needed to remain perfectly still. As the camera's lens was uncapped, Catherine felt the familiar chill, more intense than ever before. From the corner of her eye, she could see James Barrett materializing not at the edge of the group as in previous photographs, but directly behind her mother, his spectral hand reaching toward the locket at Margaret's throat. When the exposure was complete, and everyone relaxed their positions, Catherine immediately turned to where she had seen Barrett standing. But as always, there was no sign of him. However, Margaret Thornfield suddenly clutched at her throat, her face pale. "The locket," she gasped. "It's burning hot." Judge Thornfield quickly unfastened the chain from around his wife's neck, handling the locket gingerly. Indeed, the gold oval was unnaturally warm to the touch, as if it had been held near a flame. Yet Margaret's skin showed no signs of burning, and the chain itself remained cool to the touch. It was as if the heat emanated from within the locket itself, from the mysterious photographic plate it contained. "This is most extraordinary," Harper murmured, his professional curiosity overcoming his apprehension. "I've never witnessed such a physical manifestation associated with a photographic anomaly." The family retreated to the drawing room, the christening celebration temporarily forgotten as they gathered around the locket, which Judge Thornfield had placed on a small table. As they watched, the gold seemed to shimmer slightly, the engravings on its surface appearing to shift and change in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "Open it," Catherine urged, cradling her son protectively. "Whatever Barrett wants, it has something to do with what's inside." With careful fingers, Judge Thornfield opened the locket. The small square of photographic material was still there. But as the locket opened fully, exposing the square to direct sunlight, something remarkable happened. An image began to appear on the previously blank surface, faint at first, then growing clearer with each passing moment. "It's developing," Harper exclaimed. The photographic process is continuing, activated by the sunlight. The family watched in astonished silence as an image gradually formed on the small square. The face of a young woman, beautiful and serene, with a striking resemblance to Elizabeth, Catherine breathed. She looks like Elizabeth. Indeed, the woman in the image bore an uncanny resemblance to the eldest Thornfield daughter, though her clothing and hairstyle suggested that Barrett had been taken in the 1840s or earlier. The same golden hair, the same fine features, the same penetrating blue eyes that had made Elizabeth the belle of Arkansas society now looked back at them from a photograph that seemed to be developing before their eyes years after the plate had been prepared and exposed. "This is impossible," Judge Thornfield muttered, his scientific rationality challenged by the evidence before him. This woman would have sat for this portrait before Elizabeth was even born. How could she resemble her so strongly? Harper examined the developing image with professional interest. The chemical process Barrett used must have been highly unusual, designed to continue developing over many years when exposed to certain conditions. "I've never seen anything like it." As the image continued to clarify, details became visible around the woman's neck. She was wearing a locket identical to the one in which her portrait now resided. The coincidence was too perfect to be chance, suggesting a deliberate connection between the subject of the photograph and the vessel that contained it. "It's the same locket," Margaret observed. "This woman once owned it before Barrett." The implication was clear. The locket had a history that predated Barrett's ownership, a significance that might explain why his spirit remained attached to it and to the family into whose possession it had passed. But who was the woman who resembled Elizabeth so strongly? And what connection did she have to either Barrett or the Thornfields? The mystery of James Barrett and his appearances in the Thornfield family photographs had taken a new turn. The identity of the woman in the locket now became the focus of their investigation. If she resembled Elizabeth so strongly, there must be some family connection. But none of the Thornfields recognized her as a relative. Judge Thornfield wrote once more to his contact in Boston, this time including a detailed description of the woman in the locket and inquiring whether there might have been any connection between James Barrett and the Thornfield family that had previously gone undiscovered. The response, when it arrived several weeks later, contained information that would finally begin to unravel the mystery that had haunted the family for 4 years. "The woman you describe," the letter read, "sounds remarkably like Eliza Barrett, James Barrett's wife. She died in childbirth in 1849 along with their infant daughter." Barrett was devastated by the loss and became somewhat obsessed with preserving her memory through his photography. He created numerous types of her from previous sittings and was reportedly working on some new photographic technique in the days before his death. Something he claimed would transcend the limitations of conventional photography. The letter continued with a detail that sent a chill through the Thornfield family. Eliza Barrett's maiden name was Thornfield. Eliza Thornfield of Charleston, South Carolina. "I believe she may have been a distant relation of your family, William, though I cannot say exactly how you might be connected." The missing piece of the puzzle had been found. Barrett's connection to the Thornfield family was not through the judge or his immediate relatives, but through marriage to a Thornfield from a different branch of the family. This explained the resemblance between Eliza and Elizabeth. They shared Thornfield blood and by coincidence or genetic predisposition similar features, but it didn't explain why Barrett's spirit had attached itself to the Arkansas Thornfields, appearing in their family photographs and seeming to follow the female line through Elizabeth to her children. Judge William Thornfield immediately began researching his family's genealogy, focusing on the Charleston branch that had separated from his own line in the early 1800s. After extensive correspondence with relatives and historical societies, he pieced together the connection. Eliza Thornfield had been his first cousin. Once removed, the daughter of his father's cousin who had relocated to Charleston decades earlier. Eliza had moved to Boston in 1845 after her marriage to James Barrett, a promising young photographer whose studio was gaining recognition among the city's elite. Their marriage had been, by all accounts, a happy one, though tragically brief. When Eliza died in childbirth in 1849, Barrett had been inconsolable. According to accounts from friends and associates, he had thrown himself into his work with an almost manic intensity, developing new techniques and experimenting with chemical processes that pushed the boundaries of conventional photography. This discovery explained the resemblance between Eliza and Elizabeth. They shared Thornfield blood and by coincidence or genetic predisposition similar features. But it didn't explain why Barrett's spirit had attached itself to the Arkansas Thornfields, appearing in their family photographs and seeming to follow the female line through Elizabeth to her children. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Judge Thornfield received a journal that had belonged to James Barrett, discovered among his effects in Boston and forwarded to Arkansas once the connection between the families was established. The journal, bound in worn leather and filled with Barrett's precise handwriting, provided insight into the photographer's final days and the purpose behind the experimental plate contained in Eliza's locket. The journal's final entries, written in the days before Barrett's death in 1852, revealed his desperate attempt to create a photographic process that could, in his words, capture not just the image, but the essence of the subject. A process that might preserve something of the soul itself, allowing it to continue through generations, even after death has claimed the body. Barrett had become obsessed with the idea that photography might offer more than mere representation, that the chemical reactions involved in creating an image might somehow capture or preserve some essential quality of the subject. His journal detailed experiments with various chemical compounds, exposure techniques, and even what he referred to as spiritual augmentation, attempts to imbue the photographic process with ritualistic or mystical elements that might enhance its capacity to capture what he called the vital essence. Conventional science dismisses such notions as superstition. Barrett wrote, "But my observation suggests that under certain conditions, the photographic plate can register impressions beyond those made by light alone. I have created images in which subjects appear who were not physically present during the exposure. Images that cannot be explained by double exposure or chemical accident." Barrett had believed that by treating photographic plates with special chemical compounds and exposing them to certain conditions, he could create images that contained more than mere likenesses. Images that somehow preserved a fragment of the subject's spiritual essence. His final project had been an attempt to capture what remained of his beloved wife's essence in a locket that had been her most treasured possession. "I have placed within Eliza's locket a plate treated with my formula," Barrett wrote. "When completed, it will contain not just her image, but a portion of her spirit, preserved for our daughter who never drew breath. Should the child have lived, this locket would have passed to her, carrying her mother's essence through the generations of our family. Now I must find another way to ensure that Eliza's spirit continues. Perhaps through her Thornfield blood, if I can locate her relatives." The journal's final entry, dated just days before Barrett's death, revealed his intention to travel to Arkansas in search of Eliza's Thornfield relatives. "I have learned of a branch of the family in Elmwood, Arkansas, a judge and his family who may share Eliza's bloodline. If I can locate them, perhaps I can pass on the locket to one of the women of the family, ensuring that something of Eliza continues through her own blood relations." Barrett had died before he could complete his work or locate the Thornfield relatives in Arkansas. The locket, with its partially treated photographic plate inside, had somehow made its way into an estate sale after his death, where Margaret's father had purchased it as a gift for his daughter. unknowingly bringing it into the very family Barrett had been seeking. The Thornfield family finally understood the nature of Barrett's appearances. His spirit had followed the locket, attempting to complete the work left unfinished at his death, to ensure that something of Eliza Barrett's essence would continue through the female line of the Thornfield family. His presence in the wedding photographs and at christenings was not meant to frighten, but to witness these important moments in the continuation of the bloodline he and Eliza had shared briefly through their marriage. In the autumn of 1858, the Thornfields made a decision. Margaret Thornfield would wear the locket once more, not in fear but in acknowledgement of the connection between their family and the Barretts of Boston. They would no longer avoid photography but would instead embrace it, understanding that James Barrett's appearances were not malevolent hauntings, but a strange form of family reunion across the boundary between life and death. At Christmas that year, the entire extended family gathered at Willow Creek Manor for a portrait. Judge and Mrs. Thornfield, Elizabeth and Charles with their 2 children, Catherine and Thomas with baby James. The manor was decorated for the season with evergreen boughs adorning the mantels and staircase and candles illuminating the rooms with warm golden light. Outside, a light snow had fallen, rare in Arkansas, transforming the grounds into a winter wonderland that delighted the children and created a festive atmosphere. Mr. 2. Harper set up his equipment in the drawing room, where light from the large windows would provide ideal conditions for a daguerreotype. The family arranged themselves before the Christmas tree, an innovation that had only recently become popular in American homes. Inspired by traditions brought by German immigrants, Margaret wore Eliza's locket prominently at her throat, its gold surface catching the light from the candles on the tree. As the exposure began, they all felt the now familiar chill. But this time there was no fear, only acceptance. When Harper delivered the finished daguerreotype a week later, they were not surprised to see 2 additional figures in the image. James Barrett standing behind Margaret, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder where the locket lay, and beside him, faintly visible, but unmistakably present, the translucent figure of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Elizabeth Thornfield Montgomery. Eliza Barrett had joined her husband in the photograph, her spirit somehow drawn forth by the combination of the locket's presence and the bloodline she shared with the Thornfield women. Her features, so similar to Elizabeth's, were softened by a gentle smile as she looked upon the family that represented the continuation of her own lineage. In the years that followed, James and Eliza Barrett appeared in every significant family photograph taken of the Thornfields and their descendants, wedding portraits, christenings, graduations. The spectral couple stood witness to the continuation of the family line, their presence becoming so familiar that new members of the family were introduced to Cousin James and Cousin Eliza. As a matter of course, the locket passed down through generations of Thornfield women, eventually coming to Elizabeth's daughter Margaret, then to her daughter, and so on through the years. Each keeper of the locket reported occasional dreams in which Eliza Barrett spoke to them, sharing wisdom and family stories from beyond the veil between worlds. These dreams were particularly vivid during times of transition or challenge, as if Eliza's essence preserved through Barrett's experimental photography reached out to guide and comfort her descendants during their moments of greatest need. By the turn of the century, as photography became more common and the daguerreotype gave way to newer techniques, the Barretts' appearances became less distinct in family photographs, more transparent, more easily dismissed as flaws in the development process. The chemical treatments and glass plates that had once been the foundation of photography were replaced by film and mechanical cameras, technologies that perhaps lacked the mystical properties Barrett had exploited in his experiments, but they never disappeared entirely. And those with Thornfield blood could always discern their presence in the images, standing watch over the family whose bloodline they had joined through marriage and now followed through eternity. The Thornfield family of Elmwood, Arkansas, became known for their unusual family photographs, though few outside the family knew the full story behind the spectral figures that appeared in them. Some dismissed the phenomena as tricks of light or flaws in the photographic process. Others, more attuned to the mysteries that exist beyond scientific explanation, recognized that the Thornfields had somehow bridged the gap between the living and the dead through the simple act of preserving family memories on film. As photography evolved through the decades, from daguerreotypes to tint types, from glass plates to film, from black and white to color, and eventually to digital images, the Barrett's appearances evolved as well. In early color photographs from the 1950s and 60s, they appeared as figures with a bluish tint, their forms more defined than in previous decades. In Polaroid images from the 1970s, they manifested as areas of unusual brightness around certain family members, particularly those who wore or possessed the locket. And in digital photographs of the early 21st century, they appeared as mysterious orbs or areas of distortion that digital experts could not explain through conventional means. The Thornfield descendants, now scattered across America and beyond, continue to share their unusual family history with each new generation. The story of James and Eliza Barrett became part of the family lore, a tale told to children and grandchildren as they examined old photographs and contemplated their connection to ancestors long departed. The fear that had initially accompanied Barrett's appearances had long since transformed into acceptance and even affection. The spectral photographer and his wife were regarded not as haunting presences, but as guardian spirits, watching over the family with benevolent interest. As for James Barrett, the photographer whose obsession with capturing more than mere images had transcended even death itself, his spirit found the peace that had eluded him in life. By watching over the continuation of his beloved wife's bloodline, he had fulfilled his final purpose, ensuring that something of Eliza would endure through the generations. Her essence preserved not in chemicals and silver plates, but in the living descendants who carried her features, and perhaps in some ineffable way, a fragment of her spirit. The locket remains in the Thornfield family to this day, passed from mother to daughter with each generation. Its gold surface has been polished by countless hands. Its chain replaced several times over the decades, but the photographic plate inside remains unchanged. The image of Eliza Barrett as clear and detailed as it was on that afternoon in 1858 when it fully developed in the sunlight streaming through the windows of Willow Creek Manor. And though modern digital photography has replaced the chemical processes that once allowed Barrett's spirit to manifest so clearly, those with Thornfield blood still occasionally report feeling a chill when family photographs are taken. A reminder that some connections transcend both time and death, binding families together across the boundaries that separate the world of the living from whatever lies beyond. So, if you ever find yourself invited to a Thornfield family wedding, pay close attention to the photographs taken that day. Look closely at the background, at the shadows behind the smiling family members. You might just glimpse two figures standing together, a tall, hollow-cheeked man and a beautiful woman with a gold locket around her neck, watching over their family with eternal vigilance. Their presence a testament to a love that refused to be constrained by the simple fact of death. And remember, not all that appears in photographs was visible to those present when the shutter closed. Sometimes the camera captures not just light and shadow, but echoes of those who have gone before. Their spirits drawn back to witness the continuing story of the families they left behind.